Hi class, I wanted to give a video response to some of the posts and the conversations happening. One of you mentioned this idea of long distance compassion and that seems lacking in some ways, and that shapes some of our views related to immigration, undocumented workers, other kinds of things like that, or when things are happening far away. So I wanted to address this. There's actually lots of evidence, right, that our brains do not respond the same to distress far away, the same way it responds to distress close up, okay? And this happens, most of us, we can feel it intuitively. When I hear about the Australian fires, I care. Right? Like, oh man, that's awful. But it is not the same as when the fires in California are burning close to my friends and their towns, their homes, right? When it's close, I care a lot, and I know people involved, and my elephant really reacts, what can I do, how can I help, right? When it's happening in Australia, I care, but it's not the same, right? When I hear about something that happens to Haiti, I care, but when the hurricane hits Louisiana or Florida, I care more. And Americans respond more quickly, helpers are on the ground more quickly. We know that this is true, that our elephants react in all of these situations, but it's not quite the same. They've done some interesting moral dilemmas to try to highlight this, and to try to figure out why this is the case. And I'll give you a couple, and maybe this will help you, right? So here's a dilemma, and in your mind, maybe you think to yourself, what's your natural reaction tell you? Is the person morally obligated? Is the person morally permitted? Or is the person forbidden? Those are your three options, okay? Obligated means morality says you need to do this thing. If you don't, you're doing something wrong, right? Permitted means you can do it, but you don't have to do it. So permitted might be, after I make this video, I'm going to go to the movies. Most of you would say I'm morally permitted to do that. I don't have to. Morality doesn't demand that I go, but I'm certainly allowed to go, right? A moral obligation might be, my child falls and breaks their leg, I'm obligated to rush them to the hospital or something. I'm not just permitted to take them to the hospital, I'm obligated in some way. And then forbidden, of course, is when I shouldn't do that thing. I'm forbidden from slapping one of my students in the face, right, for getting a wrong answer. I would be forbidden from doing that. So here's the first dilemma. A man is driving a nice car. He just put in new leather seats, front and back. He's driving, and he sees a child on the side of the road, about 10 years old. The child has a bloody leg. They're crying. There's no one really around, just this child crying with a bloody leg. Is the man morally obligated to stop and help, even though it's probably going to cost $200 in new leather because there's going to be blood that gets in his car from this child, right? Is he obligated to stop and help anyway, right, regardless of the cost? Is he permitted to stop but not obligated? In other words, if the man just drove by the child, would you think, well, that's okay to drive by, right? It would be nice if he helped, but it's not obligatory. Or is the man forbidden from helping? Morality would say, do not stop and help, right? So think about how you would imagine that scenario of the man with the child on the side of the road. Imagine a second scenario. Remember what you said there, obligated, permitted, forbidden, right? The second scenario, a person comes home from work and is sifting through their mail, and they have a letter from UNICEF. UNICEF is a really well-known global charity. They provide resources to Africa and Asia and different places that need it, right? They have a letter from UNICEF, and UNICEF is asking for a $50 donation that can provide oral rehydration salts for places that have very little water that could save 25 lives, right, from dehydration. $50 to save 25 lives. Is the person obligated to send the $50 to UNICEF? Is the person permitted but not obligated to send the money? Or is the person forbidden from sending the money to UNICEF. When researchers run these kinds of moral dilemmas and they do it online and they get thousands of responses, most people say, about 85% say, the man driving the car is obligated to stop and help the child on the side of the road with a bloody leg. If the man drove past and did not help, about 85% of the people would say, you're doing something wrong by not helping, right? When you shift to the UNICEF example, it flips. Now about 80% of respondents say the person is permitted to send the money to UNICEF, but not obligated. So in scenario 1, we're obligated, in scenario 2, we're permitted. But why? There are people in other countries literally without water who are dying, and for $50 you could save 25 lives. One person with a bloody leg that's not even life-threatening is going to cost you $200, and yet you're obligated to stop for the child and not obligated to send the money to UNICEF. What's going on? Well, emotionally, our brains do not respond the same to these scenarios. The child with a bloody leg evokes a stronger emotional response in our brain, right? There's a stronger elephant response. You have to help. Writing a check to someplace far away does not feel the same. It does not feel as urgent. Lots of people can contribute to this. There are many people that can help. I don't know who these children are. I don't see their faces. The brain does not produce the same emotional or elephant response. And so instead of being obligated to help people overseas struggling, we're permitted, and it would be nice if we helped, but we're not obligated. Our brains do not respond the same to close-up pain as we do to long-distance pain. But if we step back rationally and say, is there really a moral difference between someone hurting next door to me and someone without enough clean water 1,000 miles, 5,000 miles away? Is there really a difference? Morally? Does God care less? How do we figure this stuff out? We feel differently about them. I think our brains have evolved to solve close-up problems, close-up pain and suffering. They did not evolve to solve pain and suffering far away. We don't feel the same, and so we don't make the same moral judgments. I find this to be very interesting. Do we need to overcome this in some way? Do Christians need to overcome this in some way, and how would we do that? The comments on the discussion board mentioned immigration. There's a second issue that arises, not just that it's another country, it's separate, but also these are people of often an out-group, right? These are people of a different country that are not part of my in-group that are wanting to come and be a part of this country. So my moral foundation of loyalty of in-group, out-group is reactive here, and I don't feel the same. Think about it this way. If you read about a group of Christians trying to spread the gospel in a country that was desperately poor, so these Christians were trying to cross a border to find resources like food and work and whatnot, and they were being detained or restrained, how do you think Christians in the United States would respond to that? Do you think Christians would say, oh my gosh, those Christians in Korea are breaking the law, they're crossing a border illegally? Or do you think Christians would have empathy and say, oh my gosh, this group of people trying to spread the gospel are crossing a border, but only because they're looking for work, they're looking for food, they're desperate? Do you think Christians would have empathy for Christians in another country crossing a border? Or do you think Christians would have judgment? My guess is Christians would have empathy for Christians in other countries crossing borders. We would see them as trying to do the right thing, as good people looking to survive, and we would be on their side emotionally. Our elephant would see them as in-group members, and we would be empathetic. But when it's someone that's not part of our in-group, when it's someone we see as an out-group and they're crossing borders, now many Christians, at least in the U.S., say, well, they're breaking the law, they're taking U.S. jobs, they're doing something wrong, and there's judgment. So it's not only the long-distance factor, there's also the in-group, out-group factor that creates psychological barriers to being really radically Christian. So I hope this is helpful. The more we understand the brain and how brains make moral judgments and moral assessments, I think it's helpful in that the more information I have about myself, it allows me to stop, calm down, slow down my judgment-making machine, and try to reflect more rationally. Try to utilize links 5 and 6 on that social intuitionist model. Something else that was brought up dealt with brain science and social media. There's a ton of information out there about brains do not do great with lots of screen time, lots of data, lots of images. Over time, those kinds of habits can actually restructure areas of the brain, right, to create lower attention, greater anxiety, greater levels of depression. One of the first really large studies, and I'll email this or I'll attach it to Canvas maybe, large-scale studies, it was 10 years after the advent of the first iPhone. So it was like 2016 or 2017, 10 years of having smartphones, and the big data was very interesting, that young people had a direct correlation between the amount of time one spent on social media correlated to the amount of anxiety and depression one felt. So as your time on social media increased, so did anxiety and depression, right? Because you're aware of all the things people are doing without you. Everyone's life looks great on social media. What about my life, right? I'm flooded with pain and suffering from across the globe, and it makes me feel very anxious, right? War, fires, earthquakes, global warming. I'm inundated with things that I can't do anything about. And so social media and information can create lots of problems. So it's a fascinating research. We're not sure. I mean, the smartphone is reshaping our brains, right? We're just not exactly sure how. And so I'm not against smartphones. I own one. But I am trying to put measures in place to monitor my screen time. I get alerts now every 3 days that talk about the amount of time on my screen, and I'm trying to decrease it, right? I'm trying to put accountability structures in to slow myself down so I have time for prayer, for real meditation, for real scripture, for fasting during Lent, for things that can separate me, for Sabbath on Saturdays. How do I begin to slow down, like technology-free Saturdays, right? This is something that certain families implement that I'm trying to implement for myself. And so I think we can begin to counteract some of these negative trends that we're seeing related to our brains, the way it affects our bodies and our emotions, and technology. Well, I hope this has been beneficial. If you have any questions, let me know, and I'll continue to see you online.